Hello everyone, this is Mr. Jackson, and today we're going to be going into Unit 3, Lesson 4, where we're going to be looking at cell differentiation. You'll know you've mastered this lesson when you have investigated how cells actually become specialized for different functions, and then you can explain to me what stem cells are. So we want to ask, again, the same question that we've been covering so far at the beginning of this unit, which is how do we grow and develop from a single-celled zygote to being made up of 40 trillion cells and 200 different types of cells? And the answer for that, each part of that, we go from 1 to 40 trillion through the process of cell division. But the one that we're going to be looking at today is we're going to go from one cell to 200 different types of cells, literally everything that's in your body, via the process of cell differentiation. And we want to explore what that is. So it all begins with a fertilized egg. Okay, so in that process of fertilization, where a sperm fertilizes an egg, that's what's going to start our process, where that zygote is actually going to begin going through cell division over and over and over again. Please remember from previous lessons that cell division is happening through mitosis, and mitosis is going to help us give rise to multiple identical cells, right? So not different yet, but early in that process after fertilization, we're going to have some rounds of mitosis where we have that initial dividing, creating more of those cells that aren't necessarily different from each other just yet. Now, differentiation, when I say that word, what do I mean? Well, that's the process where cells become specialized. So they're going to serve a specific role based on a specific function. They're going to have specific structures, and those specialized cells will become specialized tissues and organs and then organ systems until we have a fully formed human being. So with cell differentiation, we want to make sure that we break down some good terms to know. The main one is the one that you see right at the top. Okay, so differentiation involves stem cells, right? So all differentiation is going to stem from these initial stem cells. So stem cells are just those unspecialized cells that have the ability to become differentiated into any type of cell in the body. Okay, so that's what stem cells are, right? So they're kind of like blank cells, blank slates that can become anything we need them to become. Okay, now we have a couple of different ways that we can classify these cells. You are not responsible for remembering these specific terms, just good to have an understanding of them because we might use them from time to time. We have these two that more or less mean the same thing. We have types of stem cells that are totipotent or pluripotent. All this means is that they can end up developing into literally any type of cell in the body. The zygote, so that's initial fertilized egg, that is an example of something that is pluripotent, meaning it can turn into literally anything. And then within that, we have the stem cells that we have initially. It's provided in the image down here at the bottom. These are embryonic stem cells. These are the stem cells you have available when we're still embryos. So we're still in utero, and these are basically cells that have never been differentiated before. They're not necessarily in any certain place in the body, and those can truly become anything. As adults, we still have stem cells in the various tissues in our body, and we say that instead of pluripotent, that can become anything, we say that those specific stem cells are just multipotent. So they can still become different things, but not an unlimited number of things. They can only replace cells basically in the tissues where they're found. So they can become a few different things, but they're going to have some limitations. So as we get to adulthood, we still do have those stem cells all throughout our body in all of the various tissues of our body. A good amount of them are coming from our bone marrow, where we produce our red blood cells. So on those insides of our bones throughout our entire body. That's a primary place, but they're also in all kinds of tissues. And this image kind of shows this as well, right? So where we have, some stem cells that might be located in the brain tissue, those could become neurons if we were to differentiate them, as an example. And so again, it does all begin with the fertilized egg. And in order to understand what that next step is, so how do we go from just doing mitosis to actually starting the process of these cells becoming different, we have to have just a tiny bit of exposure to the initial part of fertilization, right? So this is a simplified diagram of the female reproductive system. In this case, if you look right here near the fallopian tube, we have the process of fertilization. At this point, a sperm has successfully implanted or fertilized an egg. That egg is then going to travel through the fallopian tube towards the uterus. And as it's doing so, what you can see in this diagram is we're already, from the point of a fertilized egg, that zygote, from that point, we're already going to start seeing that one cell becomes two, two becomes four, four becomes eight. That process of mitosis is already going. But whenever we hit a certain point in that process, very early, just 4 days after fertilization, we get what's called a blastocyst. And a blastocyst is the first point in time where, rather than all of the cells being exactly the same, they're now going to start differentiating. And so hopefully, in order for the process to continue, this blastocyst is going to try to implant itself into the uterine lining here, and the rest of that process for the embryo is going to take place. And so the implanted blastocyst, right, it implants in that uterine lining. It becomes what we call a gastrula. That gastrula is basically just an embryo that now has 3 differentiated germ layers, okay? So again, don't get lost in the terminology. All this is saying is that we initially had a big clump of cells that were all the same. At this point, those cells have become layered, and those layers of embryonic cells are now able to differentiate into different things. We have 3 layers. We have 3 layers for this gastrula. We have an outer, it's called the ectoderm. These can typically become, your pigment cells, skin cells, the neurons in your brain. That's typically what those will develop into. We have a middle layer, which is your mesoderm. These will ultimately become, most types of cells really, but some examples are your muscle cells, red blood cells, bone cells of your skeletal system. They become a whole lot of different things. And then the inner most layer of these embryonic cells is your endoderm, right? So that innermost layer, those can typically become like your stomach cells, the lung cells, pancreatic cells, and so forth. So at this point, ultimately what's happening is you've got 3 different layers, and each of those layers can become a whole lot of different cells. And the process in which we start creating these different cells, different organs and organ systems, we call that process organogenesis. It literally means this is how we create organs that have their own thing going on. And so with stem cells, I did want to give you one example of how we're actually applying stem cells, how we're actually utilizing these in regenerative medicine. So if you look at this diagram here, again, a common place for even adult stem cells is in our bone marrow. And this will show a process for how stem cells can actually be filtered out of that bone marrow, and they'll ultimately be removed from like a hip bone. And we can actually inject those into damaged tissues like a heart after a heart attack. And what that can then do is the heart environment, right? So the existing healthy muscle cells of the heart will actually stimulate those stem cells to become new heart muscle cells, right? So again, if we just administer these undifferentiated cells into a certain area, they sort of learn that that's the job that they need to be doing. And that's where we get into like cell signaling. It's kind of the way in which cells talk to each other. So basically, these undifferentiated cells can be used to repair or replace damaged cells and tissues, like after heart attacks, or they can be used to, treat brain cells after a stroke, nerve cells after spinal cord injuries. So there's so many opportunities in helping individuals where otherwise all hope might be lost. And so we're going to finish up this conversation just by going back to our basics, right? You've seen this diagram time and time again, and this will help us get an appreciation for these levels of organization that we use to study biology, right? Again, we're always going to start from the bottom with this most basic layer of life. Life itself begins at the layer of the cell. And an example of this might be a muscle cell, right? Any cell in your body that has a specialized function is a cell type. We have like 200 in our body. Then those cells come together, groups of cells that work together for a common function. We call those tissues. So muscle cells come together to make smooth muscle tissue, as one example. And then all of those tissues can come together and work together for a common function. That's an organ. This might be smooth muscle tissues coming together to form the stomach. And if we take enough of those different organs working together for common functions, that's where you get a system, an organ system, like your digestive system. Put all those organ systems together, everything's fully functioning and supporting life itself, and now you've got an individual member of a species, like a human being, that is an organism. And so going back to those learning objectives, you can feel free to hit pause right here and go through those just to kind of have a little description of what we're looking for with these mastery sort of checkpoints. But remember, we need to be able to say that we've looked into how cells become specialized to serve their different functions, and we need to be able to explain what stem cells are and their importance for regenerative medicine, for example. So that is going to actually conclude our discussion on how do we go from a single cell to being 40 trillion cells with over 200 cell types. And so I hope that you found this lesson helpful, and we'll see you at the next one.